What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 exploits that are common enough in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. A few days ago, while covering this game, I had an idea for a fun video where we talk about some of the exploits that people can take advantage of in the game. Though I want to start this video off by talking about what these are and, are they bugs? Are they going to get fixed? What's going on? Well, in a couple cases, things are actually working exactly as intended. If anything, we're just taking advantage of them to work probably a little better than they're supposed to. However, in several other cases, they are 100% exploits. They are things that should not work, but do. Usually mechanics that should not work together. However, in terms of the probability of these things getting fixed, some of these things have been around since Kingmaker, so I wouldn't count on it. Moreover, this is a single-player game where balance isn't really all that important, especially with a game with so many difficulty options, etc. So I have no doubt in my mind that Owlcat is probably very familiar with many of these, if not all of them, and is either leaving them in for the sake of just people having fun with them, or due to some maybe technical limitation with the calculations, it might just be impossible for all I know. But either way, I would not really expect most of these to get fixed, and in a couple cases, they're not even broken to begin with, in, terms of whether or not they're working. But with no further ado, let's actually jump into this thing and talk about some of them. Now, I want to kick this off with what is arguably the most common one, and that is the experience gain exploit. Now, this did actually get turned off for the DLCs, or 2 of them in particular, Through the Ashes and the most recent one, the Midnight Isles. In Inevitable Excess, you're already max level, so it kind of doesn't really matter. However, in the other 2 DLCs, it got turned off because it kind of just broke those DLCs in terms of the progression and how they're supposed to work. But in the main campaign, this is still working, and it's working because it's intended to work this way, if that makes sense. However, it is a bit exploitable. Now, what I'm talking about is turning on or off the option to assign experience to your entire party. Now, by default, this is turned off, meaning that experience is distributed appropriately across your entire team. However, if you wanted to play the game solo or something, you might turn this on so your character gets increased experience and thus levels up faster. However, in the course of a normal game, turning this on would cause all of the party members that are not with you to not gain experience, thus not level up, making their companion quests very, very difficult. Now, it's important to note that this option does not technically affect the difficulty setting of the game. This is because, again, for the people who want solo as an option, this is an important part of that. But because of the way it's implemented and the moments throughout the story where our main character is alone or does not yet have a full party of 6, thus leaving other people outside of the party to not get experience, you can take advantage of it. Most notably right at the beginning of the game and a couple places a little bit later. Now, this will actually cause you to get a couple levels ahead of where you would normally be. However, due to the sort of experience scaling in the later game, where the experience gains required are much more, it kind of calms down a little bit. But basically, all you've got to do is turn this on while you have less companions than a party of 6, and you're going to get increased experience. And then when you get more than 6 companions, or a full party of 6, you turn it back on so everyone's getting experience equally outside of your party. But for the times that you have less than 6 people in your party, you are gaining increased experience the entire time. Just as an example that you've probably seen on screen already, with this turned on in the beginning of the game, you can see an event where I get 750 experience with this turned on as opposed to just 125 with it turned off. A very useful little trick to get you ahead of the game in the early game. But moving on to our second exploit. We have the most common 2 dips in the game that people take advantage of to get very, very high ACs in a manner that honestly probably shouldn't work. In the pen and paper, this wouldn't really be a thing, or the chances of you dealing with a GM that would allow this are incredibly unlikely. But in the game, it does stack, and it kind of is working as intended, so kind of just is what it is. But that is the Scaled Fist Monk and the Oracle Seeker. Now, individually, these 2 classes get a ton of buffs. There's plenty of reasons to play both. They're popular for a reason. However, you can take a level 1 dip into both of these classes to get a kind of insane AC right out of the gate. So Scaled Fist Monk allows you to get, while you are unarmored, a bonus to your AC that is equal to your Charisma modifier. By itself, pretty good. But if you combine that at level 2 with, say, an Oracle Seeker, you can take the Nature Mystery, which will give you access to a revelation called Nature's Whispers, which will turn your Dexterity modifier to armor class that everyone gets into your Charisma modifier to armor class that everyone gets, meaning that you are getting your Charisma modifier to your AC twice. And because a ton of other classes use Charisma as their primary stat, you can then kind of lean into a more proper casting class, all the while stacking Charisma and AC. You combine this with a bunch of the bonus feats that you can potentially get as well, or several other kind of multi-dip monstrosities that turn even this into kind of more craziness. But just this by itself, you combine it with something like Mage Armor, which is going to give you even more armor for being unarmored, and you can get a very high AC very, very quickly. But that brings us to our third exploit, and that is Elemental Barrage. This is another one where technically I would say we're not exactly using it in a way that isn't working as intended, but we're definitely using it in a bit of a different way. So a couple things about the description of Elemental Barrage. This is a mythic ability we can get as soon as mythic ability level 1. Now, the description of this ability seems to imply you should use it for spells. However, it works with all energy damage attacks. That means attacks that are made by your weapon that have energy damage attached. So a weapon that deals fire or acid damage, for instance, would also be enough to set this off. Moreover, with the way the game works, technically an attack is made for every damage type on a weapon. So if you hit an enemy and it does like 3 different types of energy damage, technically, while it's not what's happening on your end, behind the scenes in the game's calculations, what you've actually done is made 4 different attacks, the base weapon, and then 1 with each energy type. So knowing that information is crucial to understanding that Elemental Barrage can be set off multiple times by the same character in the same attack, which will just add a ton of free damage. So there are situations when you get to the later parts of the game where characters will have several attacks per round combined with a weapon that deals several types of elemental damage, and you can have a melee character using Elemental Barrage and setting it off 3 or 4 times a round. Now, you'll see this most commonly used with charge builds with a Kitsune that has Vulpine Pounce, which means they can charge and make a full attack, but overall, just a very strong ability if you understand how it actually works. Moving on to number 4. This one is straight up an exploit. It's been around since Kingmaker, it's well known, but quite frankly, it's not supposed to work. And that is Selective Grease. So Grease is a level 1 spell. Basically, it makes grease on the ground and enemies can slip in it. Selective, and what that word means is that it's a meta magic, actually, which allows you to not target your allies with a spell that normally would. So you could, for instance, cast a fireball directly at the enemy and your companions would be safe. It's important to note, though, that selective meta magic is not supposed to work with anything that is not AoE and instantaneous. Grease has a duration, it hangs out, it lasts, which means it's not supposed to work with selective meta magic. But it does, as you can clearly see on screen here, we can easily meta magic this up. This will raise its minimum level to 2, but you combine this with, say, a wizard specializing in conjuration to kind of raise the DC, and you'll probably trivialize the entirety almost of Act 1. There are a couple of enemies it doesn't really work on, like flying enemies, for instance, aren't affected by this. But for the most part, this spell by itself will trivialize the first couple acts of the game, especially if you work on getting that DC up a little bit, because enemies will just trip all over themselves while your companions stand directly in the grease unaffected. And that specific scenario is why selective is not supposed to work with grease, but it does. And also a couple other things it's not supposed to, but this is the most common application. And last but not least, a personal favorite of mine because it involves the kineticist. And again, technically this is working as intended. It's just made ridiculous even more than it already was in Kingmaker by the addition of the Ascendant Element ability. Thanks to mythic powers, we get an ability, or potentially can get an ability called Ascendant Element. This will let us pick fire, cold, whatever, and that element, whenever we use it, will completely ignore resistances and immunities to it. So if something's immune to fire and we're dealing fire damage, if we have Ascendant Element, it hits anyway. Meaning you could hit a fire elemental with like Scorching Ray and still be just fine. Now, kineticists, since Kingmaker, have had a very ridiculous combo known as Deadly Earth. You can combine this with things like Trip to just basically destroy enemies. This is more of a mid-game thing. You can't really get Deadly Earth until level 13, and you of course have to have the, Earth element to get it. But what it does is it casts an AoE on the ground that will deal damage to any enemy that is in the area. However, this is important because Deadly Earth does not do attack rolls, it doesn't do saves, it just deals damage. If the enemy is there and in the area, they take the damage, period. However, we can take this a little bit farther with Ascendant Element. We can combine Deadly Earth with something like the Fire Element to then give us like a Lava Deadly Earth or a Magma Deadly Earth, I think it's called. And this will allow us to effectively cast a Deadly Earth with the Ascendant Element that is completely unresistible by pretty much anything. The enemy does not get an attack roll. You can combine it with infusions like Bowling to just trip enemies as well, potentially. And if you want to go a step farther, you can hire a bunch of mercenaries to use as kineticists and stack the Deadly Earths on top of each other to where you are dealing hundreds of unresistible damage to an enemy per round. And if you double this up with a similar infusion called Wall, which effectively does the same thing, you can just slaughter enemies before they even have a chance to move or come at you. And this is fun mostly because it kind of just requires the complete control over a party that a game like this allows. This isn't something you'd see in like the TTRPG because, it's just you. And also you could potentially hurt your companions, for instance. But this is a fun, very abusable and well-known thing that a lot of people do, and that is going to top off our video, guys, of 5 common exploits that can be used and abused in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. I enjoyed making it, but thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.